Well, welcome to week 5, video 1 for PSC 355. And in this video, we're going to be looking at what countries or governments' monetary policy choices are. The central question we're going to answer in this video is what monetary policy trade-offs do governments face? To answer this question, we need to summarize the three basic national monetary policy instruments. The first of these is the exchange rate, which varies along two dimensions, the regime and the level. The second is whether or not a country is going to impose international capital controls to restrict the flow of money in and out of the economy. And the third is the domestic interest rate. We're going to talk about each of these in turn. So let's start with the first. Policy choice number 1, the exchange rate. If you've ever traveled internationally, you've had some experience with exchange rates before. A very simple definition of the exchange rate is the price of one country's currency expressed in another country's currency. So again, if you travel to Europe, you know that you have to exchange dollars for euros, and that exchange rate might be different on any given day. National exchange rate policies have two dimensions. The first is what we call the regime, whether or not a government chooses a fixed exchange rate regime or a floating exchange rate regime. And the second is what's called the level. We might also call this the value. And this indicates whether or not the currency is a strong currency or a weak currency. We'll discuss each of these in turn here in a moment. So let's look at this first dimension, the regime, fixed or float. A fixed exchange rate, if we take a look at a fixed exchange rate over time, this is the Venezuelan Bolivar exchange rate with the US dollar beginning in 2010 all the way through most of 2014. And what you can see there is that for very long periods of time, the exchange rate doesn't change, right? It's exactly the same. In fact, since around 2013, the Venezuelan Bolivar exchange rate with the US dollar has been 16 cents. It has been fixed to the dollar. It doesn't change. And this is because the Venezuelan government commits to that exchange rate. In other words, essentially promises both its own citizens and any international investor that this is the value of our currency. There are some benefits of this. This enhances credibility and stability for the government because it's promising, right, that fixed exchange rate over time. It can benefit domestic sectors that are involved in international trade and investment. We'll come back to this in a few videos. It will make some more sense. The main point I want to make here is that there are some costs as well to a fixed exchange rate, and probably the most important cost is that the government must defend this fixed exchange rate, or we might call it a pegged to the dollar as well. And the basic reason the government has to defend this is when you fix an exchange rate, the government is promising anyone who wants to exchange a Venezuelan bolivar for US dollars, the government is promising to give that individual 16 cents for every Venezuelan bolivar. And the point here is that the government of Venezuela only has a fixed amount of US dollars in what we call the foreign exchange reserves of Venezuela. And so if Venezuela would ever run out of US dollars, then it would not be able to defend or to back up that peg. Because again, the promise here is that yes, we'll give you 16 cents for every Venezuelan bolivar, but what if enough people ask for dollars in exchange for bolivar that the Venezuelan government runs out of US dollars? In that case, it would be forced to abandon the fixed exchange rate. Next week, we'll talk about currency crises, and this will illustrate this point even more. Now, a floating exchange rate is different. A floating exchange rate, a government is not making a promise for the value of their currency. You can see here the euro to US dollar exchange rate, and over time between 2010 and 2014 that value has been as high as $1.50. 1 euro would be exchanged for $1.50, or even as low as $1.20. This isn't updated. In fact, if you were to look at it, the euro today, it would be more close to $1, the very bottom of that graph. So floating exchange rates vary much more significantly over time. Now, this means that the exchange rate is determined by market demand for the currency. If there is more demand for euros, then the value of the euro is going to go up. If there's less demand, it's going to fall. This can add some increased flexibility for the government and the economy for changing market conditions, but we'll also see in a future video how it can also lead to conflict. The next thing to mention, that relates to the exchange rate governments have to consider is whether they want a strong or a weak currency. A strong currency raises the purchasing power of its citizens. If the US dollar is stronger, foreign goods are cheaper for Americans. But because foreign goods are cheaper in the United States, if the dollar's strong, that means that imports are more competitive and it's going to hurt American producers, right? So Hondas are going to be cheaper relative to GM and Ford vehicles, and so that's going to hurt American manufacturers. A weak currency has the opposite effect. It lowers purchasing power. In other words, that means that foreign goods are going to cost more for citizens, but it means that the goods produced domestically are now going to be more competitive abroad. If you have a weak exchange rate, that means so if it's the dollar again, if the dollar is weak, that means American cars, Fords and GMs, are going to be more competitive abroad if they're produced here in the US. So there are some significant trade-offs to this, and an important thing to highlight here is there are obvious implications for trade from the exchange rate, right? A strong or a weak exchange rate has a lot to do with the competitiveness of an economy's trade situation. A simple way to think about the different options for countries would be they could fit in this simple 2x2 where they could have a weak or strong currency or a fixed or floating currency, and you could imagine a different option in each of these four quadrants. All right, moving on to the next policy choice. Governments also have to make decisions about the domestic interest rate. An interest rate, of course, in its simplest sense, is the amount charged by a lender to a borrower for the use of an asset. Central banks are typically the institution that set a national interest rate. Lower rates are designed to stimulate economic activity and growth. So when an economy is not growing very fast, central banks will usually lower interest rates. Higher interest rates are designed to slow down growth that might be too fast, and especially to slow fears of inflation, where money becomes worth less over time. So it's a basic central strategy monetary policy tool for the central bank to influence the growth rate and inflation in an economy. Now, all else equal, though, there are some international effects to interest rates as well. Obviously, a higher interest rate means that if you're an owner of liquid capital money, that's going to raise your returns because you're getting more money in exchange for putting your money in the bank. And it's going to create incentives to save money, not to spend money. But there are these international capital consequences to interest rates as well. When interest rates are high, that's going to attract foreign money into your economy, right? Because foreigners are going to say, look at the great return on investment in that country. We could put our savings into that country and we would get a much higher return than we would here at home. So it's going to attract money in when interest rates are high. But when interest rates drop very low, then that means that anyone who's saved money and invested money in that economy is going to look abroad and move money out. So the basic sense here, right, is that domestic interest rates are designed to influence domestic economic conditions, but they can attract foreign money in and they can push domestic money out. A brief aside, why does money flow across borders? There's a term economists use called factor price equalization. The basic idea here is that factors of production flow to countries with the highest returns. So if your return for capital is higher in a given country, that's going to attract money in. And if the return to capital is low in a particular country, that's going to send money out. Now this brings us to the third policy choice, international capital controls. Capital controls are, in the most basic sense, a tax on all capital moving across a country's borders. Controls can be used to slow or deter those capital inflows we just talked about, or slow and deter those capital outflows. Right? So you can imagine in the event that an interest rate is rising or falling and driving international capital flows, a government can impose these taxes on money moving in or out to try to stop that from happening. Now, This also brings us to a brief discussion about something called the Mundell-Fleming or the unholy trinity. There's a brief grade section in your textbook that you want to read about this in your readings this week. It will summarize what we're going to discuss here, so I would emphasize that you go back and look at that. But let's just briefly discuss it here as well. So Mundell-Fleming states that these three policy choices governments have present them with a trilemma of sorts. States can only sustain two of the following three policies: a fixed exchange rate, international capital mobility, meaning you allow money in and out to move freely, and having independent monetary policy, which means you're able to set your interest rate based off of your domestic economic policy preferences. In other words, you're not setting your interest rate to influence capital flows, you're setting your interest rate to address concerns about growth or employment. And Mundell-Fleming says you can only have two of these three. You can't have a fixed exchange rate, you can't allow money to move across borders, and you can't have independent monetary policy. You just can't do it all. So let's look at an example that might help unpack why this is the case. Let's imagine we have a country that's opted for a fixed exchange rate, right? It wants the stability and credibility of a fixed exchange rate. And it's a strong exchange rate. We'll say the currency is very strong, and it's pegged, it's fixed at 1 peso, let's say, to $1 US. Okay, so the government says we promise that every peso you give us, we'll give you $1 if you want. That's the exchange rate. It's also opted to have independent monetary policy. It wants to be able to set its interest rate to influence the domestic economy. And in this case, it wants to have a low interest rate because the government, let's say, is concerned about high unemployment and low economic growth. So it wants to lower interest rates to jumpstart the economy. And thus far, the government has given up international capital mobility. It has not allowed money to move freely across borders. That is, it has imposed international capital controls. Now, let's say at a given moment the government says we change our minds. We actually want to have international capital mobility. We want to allow foreigners to invest in our country, and we want to allow our citizens to invest their money abroad. So think about this for just 1 second. What's going to happen? Remember, we have a situation here where the exchange rate is fixed, monetary policy is independent, but we know it's a low interest rate. Low interest rate. So you're not getting a great return on capital. Now you can move money abroad. What are you going to do if you're a liquid capital owner, if you have cash in the bank? You're going to move your money out of the country to a place where interest rates are higher now that those taxes, that those capital controls have been removed. And so money's going to flow out of that country. Now, what's going to happen in this situation? As money flows out, remember that individuals are going to go to that central bank and they're going to say, hey, we would like $1 in exchange for our local currency, our peso, because you can't take pesos and invest them in a foreign country. So you're going to want a hard currency like the US dollar. And so more and more investors are going to go to essentially to that central bank and say, we want $1 for every one of our pesos. And so millions and millions of pesos will be exchanged for dollars. And as it comes closer and closer to running out of dollars to back up that fixed exchange rate, this is going to give the country, the government, a real dilemma. And so what can it do? What can it do to stop that money from flowing out? Well, first thing it could do is it could raise interest rates. Right? This makes sense. If you make your interest rates higher, that's going to make it attractive for investors to move their money into your country, and it could suck some of that money in, meaning that that pressure on the exchange rate would go away. But the problem with this is if you raise your interest rates because of international capital flows, you're giving up your independent monetary policy because you're raising the interest rate not because that's what you think is best for your domestic economy. You're raising the interest rate because international capital flows are forcing you to make that decision. Now, you have another option. You could also devalue the currency, allow your currency to float perhaps, which would mean you wouldn't be promising to give $1 for every peso anymore. It might be that if you devalue the currency, you might only have to give, say, a quarter for every peso. You could devalue it by a significant amount, and that would reduce the pressure on your foreign exchange reserves as you're running out of dollars. But of course, if you do this, you're giving up the fixed exchange rate. So the basic point here is that you can't have all of these things. No government is capable of sustaining all three of these policy choices. And this is a really great model, the unholy trinity or Mundell-Fleming, that sums up the trade-offs governments face when they have to make monetary policy choices.